On the morning of October 25th, 1415, King Henry V of England stood on a muddy ridge in northern France and looked death in the eye. From his vantage point, the 29-year-old king saw a nightmare. Stretching across the horizon was a wall of steel, 30,000 French soldiers, the finest fighting men in Europe. They were well fed, rested, and encased in the best plate armor money could buy. Henry looked back at his own lines. He commanded a skeleton army, just 6,000 men. Most of them were archers, common peasants clad in rags. They were starving. They hadn't slept in 2 days. And, most terrifying of all, the majority were suffering from dysentery, the bloody flux. They were literally dying on their feet before the battle even began. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. 5-to-1 odds. In the heavy infantry sector, it was nearly 10-to-1. To any military strategist of the 15th century, this wasn't a battle setup. It was a crime scene waiting to happen. The French commanders were so confident that they were already playing dice for who would capture the English king. They had even commissioned a special cart, painted and gilded, to carry Henry to Paris in chains. But Henry V did not surrender. He did not run. He looked at that wall of French steel, then he looked at the mud beneath his boots, and he made a calculation that would change the history of warfare forever. This wasn't just courage. This was the cold, hard desperation of a man who knew the only way home was through the chests of his enemies. Welcome to Agincourt, the battle that proved armor could be a coffin, and that a starving peasant with a piece of wood could kill a prince. To understand why this battle was suicide, you have to understand the hell these men had just walked through. 6 weeks earlier, Henry V had invaded France to claim the crown. It was supposed to be a glorious campaign. It turned into a disaster. The siege of Harfleur had taken too long and cost too many lives. Disease had ravaged his camp. By October, Henry just wanted to go home. He was marching his broken army toward the port of Calais to escape. But the French knew he was wounded. They shadowed him, mirroring his movements along the River Somme, cutting off every bridge, stripping every farm of food. They were starving the English into submission. When Henry finally crossed the river and turned north, he found the trap had snapped shut. The French army had outmarched him. They parked themselves across the narrow gap between the woods of Tramecourt and Agincourt. They blocked the only road to safety. The political stakes were absolute. If Henry lost here, the House of Lancaster was finished. His father had usurped the throne, and Henry's legitimacy hung by a thread. A defeat meant his death, the imprisonment of his brothers, and civil war back in England. But look at the physical reality of the battlefield. It had been raining for 2 weeks. The ploughed fields between the two woods had turned into a thick, clay-heavy sludge. This wasn't just wet dirt. This was a glue trap. The French were on the north side, barring the way. The English were on the south. The French had 30,000 men, including thousands of heavy cavalry and elite knights. Logistics, wine, meat, dry tents, and pages to help them armor up. The terrain, they just had to stand there. If Henry didn't attack, his army would starve to death in a few days. The English had 6,000 men, mostly archers with long bows. No food. They were eating nuts and berries scavenged from the forest. Sickness. The dysentery was so bad that many archers had cut the backs of their breeches off because they couldn't stop relieving themselves. It was a battle between the ultimate professional soldiers, the French knights, and a group of sick, dirty men with bows. Let's look at the enemy. The French army wasn't just big, it was a juggernaut. This was the gendarmerie. The French knight in 1415 was the tank of the medieval world. He wore full plate armor, 60 pounds of hardened steel that covered him from head to toe. A sword couldn't cut it, a spear couldn't pierce it. Even most arrows would bounce off the curved breastplates. Leading them was the Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, and the great Dukes of Orléans and Bourbon. But they had a problem: ego. Every French noble wanted to be in the front row. Why? Because that's where the glory was. That's where you captured English lords and held them for ransom. So instead of a disciplined formation, the French vanguard became a crowded mosh pit of arrogant aristocrats. They pushed the professional crossbowmen to the back. They pushed their cannons to the rear. They ignored their own battle plan because they were terrified that someone else might kill Henry V before they could. They looked across the field at the English and saw nothing, just a thin line of men. The French scouts reported back. They are quiet. They are afraid. They were wrong. The English weren't quiet because of fear. They were quiet because they were praying. They were listening to their king. Henry gave a speech that morning. Shakespeare wrote a poetic version of it, but the real history is grittier. Henry didn't just talk about honor, he told them the truth. He told the archers that if the French won, they would cut off 3 fingers from every man's right hand, so they could never draw a bow again. He gave them a choice: fight like devils, or live the rest of your life as a crippled beggar. For 4 hours, nothing happened. The two armies stared at each other. The French were content to wait. They knew the English were hungry. Henry knew he couldn't wait. But he also knew he couldn't attack. If his archers left their defensive positions, the French cavalry would ride them down in seconds. So Henry V did something insane. At 11 a.m., he ordered his army to strike banners. He ordered his archers to pull up their stakes, long, sharpened wooden poles they used for protection, and advance. Imagine the madness of this. 5,000 archers, carrying their bows and heavy wooden stakes, walking 700 yards across an open field toward 30,000 enemies. They were completely exposed. If the French cavalry had charged at that moment, the English army would have been wiped out. The battle would have lasted 5 minutes, but the French just watched. Why? Because they were confused. They didn't think the English were attacking. They thought the English were moving to a new camping spot. Or perhaps they were just too busy eating lunch. It was a failure of command that would cost France a generation of men. The English marched until they were 300 yards from the French line, extreme bow range. With a shout, the archers halted. They hammered their stakes back into the mud, angling them forward like a prickly hedge. The trap was reset. They were now right under the French nose. And then the silence broke. Sir Thomas Erpingham, the commander of the archers, threw his baton into the air and shouted, "Now strike!" 5,000 English longbows rose. We need to understand the weapon that won this battle, the English war bow. This wasn't a toy. It was a 6-foot piece of yew wood with a draw weight of 150 pounds. Pulling it back required the same effort as lifting a grown man off the ground with 2 fingers. A trained archer could fire 10 to 12 arrows a minute. Multiply that. 5,000 archers. 10 arrows a minute. That is 50,000 arrows every 60 seconds. When the first volley was loosed, the sky actually turned black. The sound was described as a massive, tearing canvas sheet. The arrows didn't just hit the French, they hammered them. The French heavy cavalry, stung by the insult of being shot at by peasants, finally charged. But the mud, the field was a swamp. The heavy horses struggled to get up to speed, and as they galloped, the arrow storm hit them. The plate armor of the knights might stop an arrow, but the horses were vulnerable. Arrows struck the animals in the chest, the neck, and the flank. The result was chaos. Wounded horses reared and bucked, throwing their riders into the mud. Animals panicked and turned back, crashing into the infantry behind them. The French charge wasn't stopped by a wall of spears, it was stopped by pain and panic. But the French infantry, the thousands of men-at-arms on foot, kept coming. They put their heads down, hiding their faces behind their helmets, and marched into the arrow storm. It was like walking into a blizzard of steel. They reached the English line, and the real horror began. This is where the geography of Agincourt turned into a weapon. The battlefield narrowed at the English end between the two woods. As the massive French army advanced, they were funneled inward. They were squeezed. Imagine a crowd crush at a concert, but everyone is wearing metal suits and carrying axes. The French knights in the front row reached the English stakes and were stopped. But the men behind them, thousands of them, didn't know to stop. They kept pushing forward. The pressure became lethal. French knights were pressed so tightly together they couldn't lift their arms to swing their swords. Men began to scream, not because they were cut, but because they were being crushed to death inside their own armor. They slipped in the mud, and once a man in full plate armor falls into deep, sucking mud, he doesn't get up. He drowns, he suffocates. And then the English archers did the unthinkable. They ran out of arrows, so they dropped their bows. They drew swords, axes, and heavy lead mallets used to hammer in the stakes, and they charged. This was the pivotal moment. The French were exhausted, stuck in the mud, pinned by their own numbers and overheating in their armor. The English archers were unarmored. They were light. They danced over the mud. It wasn't a duel, it was a slaughter. The archers swarmed the stranded knights. They used mallets to dent helmets and crush skulls. They used daggers to find the gaps in the armor, the eyes, the groin, the armpit. The pride of French chivalry was beaten to death by starving peasants with hammers. The pile of bodies began to rise. Chronicles say the wall of the dead grew as high as a man's face. The English fought from atop this mound of corpses, hacking down at the enemy. The fighting lasted barely 3 hours. By the afternoon, the French army, the greatest in Europe, was shattered. But there was one final dark chapter. Towards the end of the battle, Henry saw the French rearguard regrouping. He also heard that his baggage train was being raided. Henry panicked. He had thousands of French prisoners sitting in his rear. If they realized the English were distracted, they could pick up weapons and attack from behind. So Henry gave the order, "Kill the prisoners." His knights refused, not out of mercy, but because those prisoners were worth a fortune in ransom. So Henry ordered the archers to do it. It was a brutal, cold-blooded massacre. Hundreds of French nobles who had surrendered expecting mercy were stabbed or bludgeoned to death while they sat on the ground. It was a war crime by modern standards, but it worked. The French rearguard, seeing their friends butchered, fled the field. The sun set on a field of blood. The numbers were impossible. The French lost nearly 10,000 men. They lost 3 dukes, 5 counts, and 90 barons. France effectively lost its entire government in one afternoon. The English lost, estimates vary, but likely between 112 and 600 men. It was the most lopsided victory in the history of medieval warfare. King Henry V returned to London a hero. The Battle of Agincourt didn't just secure his crown, it became a legend that England would cling to for 600 years. But the real lesson of Agincourt isn't about English glory. It is a lesson about arrogance. The French lost because they believed their own hype. They believed that technology, armor, and status, nobility, guaranteed victory. They forgot the variables of war, the terrain, the weather, the desperation of a man with nothing left to lose. On October 25th, 1415, the medieval world changed. The knight, the invincible tank of the battlefield, was proven obsolete. He was defeated not by another knight, but by the mud and by the common soldier. If you want to understand more about the weapon that killed the age of chivalry, click this video here where we break down the terrifying physics of the English longbow. And don't forget to subscribe for more battles that changed history.